Hello, I'm Dave Hill. I'm the founder, publisher, and editor of the journalism website on london.co.uk. My guest for this podcast is Professor Tony Travers of the LSE, and I am going to ask Tony a very simple but quite large question. It's about the government's Fair Funding Review, which is deciding how government money is going to be allocated for local authorities across the country. Tony, is the Fair Funding Review fair to London?
I think many Londoners will think it isn't. Let's just, to be fair to the government, to be fair to everybody, let's sort of step back a bit. Councils, as you rightly imply, get their money partly from council tax, the thing we all really know about, the bill that arrives every April. But they also get a chunk of money from central government. And that chunk of money from central government includes money from national taxpayers, some money from the business rates, but you add that to what the council raises locally from council tax, and that broadly delivers what they can spend. And of course, the money that's received from Whitehall, from central government, includes an element of measures of needs and the capacity of a council to raise money from the council tax. So different councils have different needs. Some are relatively affluent, some have large numbers of deprived people living in them, and the grant is supposed to equalise between them for that right across England. And then equally, some councils have many more properties with high values, so they can raise more money from council tax than others. And the grant system also takes account of all of that and makes it fairer across the country. Now, it hasn't been reviewed for a number of years, 15 or more years. And so the government is instituting this so-called Fair Funding Review, which will bring all the data underpinning it up to date, change some of the ways of calculating the way grants are allocated, new ways of measuring need, perhaps in some cases. Add all of that together, and London as a whole loses resources. The Midlands and the North gain resources. Some other councils in the south of England actually lose as well. But within that, there are some outer London gainers. So inner London does very, very badly. Many outer London boroughs, notably Enfield, do rather well. So it's a mixed picture, but overall London will be rather worse off than it is now in terms of spending by the council.
And how is that going to affect, if it happens, and as you will know better than most, there's quite a lot of negotiating going on, and people like London councils doing calculations and asking the government, well, how on earth did you come up with this formula, and how did you come up with this number? And why aren't housing costs being factored into these calculations? That's one of the big ones for them, isn't it? So there's a lot of that going on, and it could all change. But as things stand, what are the implications for Londoners on a sort of, in terms of their daily lives, likely to be?
Well, it's true that the government's still consulting about all of this. And of course, the fact that we have any numbers at all to work with are because London councils, whom you mentioned, represent all the London boroughs. One or two external agencies, a consultancy called Pixel, they've done the Institute for Fiscal Studies. They all come up with the same broad analysis. Government itself hasn't produced any figures yet, because they know if they did that, everybody would immediately pounce on them and say this is wrong or unfair or something. So when we do hear them, in detail from the government, which probably won't be till quite close to Christmas, less time to react, and I suspect tactically that's what the government thinks would help it. But to answer your question, what it will mean is that boroughs that lose out, and many inner London boroughs will lose out on the current figures, they will have less money to spend on services. It's that simple. Council tax is capped. So unless the government was suddenly to allow councils to put up their council tax even more than the 5% they're currently saying they should go up, then spending will have to fall. And of course, because social care for children and older people is largely protected, that means that the services that really get hit are street lighting, street cleaning, potholes, and antisocial behaviour, graffiti, all the stuff we see outside our front doors. So if it turns out as it looks as if it might, it'll probably mean for many parts of inner London a slightly, to use the technical term, grottier environment moving forward.
We could do a whole separate podcast on that whole street environments thing. Having looked at some of these projections that you referred to, and the boroughs, the inner London boroughs that look at the moment set to do very badly. Among that list, that select list, we have some quite famous ones: Westminster, Wandsworth, Kensington, and Chelsea. And at least two of those, I think perhaps all three, have for a very long time been able to set very low council tax levels. So is there a sense in which there's a kind of historic, to coin a phrase, levelling up going on of those boroughs in particular, do you think?
Well, it's true that when the current system of council tax that we have came in 1993, and it replaced the poll tax, which had been so successful that there were riots in Trafalgar Square, and actually it more or less cost Mrs. Thatcher her job. So it was big news at the time. But when the poll tax was first introduced in 1990, the then local government minister, Kenneth Baker, still in the House of Lords, Conservative peer, he ensured that the way the grant system worked at that point, it really helped Wandsworth and Westminster and allowed them to produce very low poll taxes. And that benefit has carried through into the council tax and all the way through to today, so that you regularly get stories in the media along the lines of, Buckingham Palace pays less in council tax than a semi-detached house in Plymouth. Well, I'm afraid that's actually literally true. So, if there's only one person, just one property, and it's a single residence, like Buckingham Palace, does only pay one relatively small council tax in Westminster. So, yes, the ministers and probably the civil service think they're trying to do something about that. Perhaps they hoped that they could reduce the central government funding to Wandsworth and Westminster, to some extent Kensington and Chelsea. Then the question is, how do they put the council tax up? Because it's capped. Will ministers allow a 15 or 20% council tax to make up the lost central government funding? Well, they haven't said that. But more than that, worse than that in some ways, if central government changes the grant arrangements for Westminster, it'll hit Camden. Change them for Wandsworth or Kensington and Chelsea, it'll affect Southwark and Lambeth and frankly Hackney, because they're all so similar in so many ways. So as a result of all of this, a number of boroughs who already have average levels of council tax, or even slightly higher than average ones, will also get caught in all of this. And of course, we all know it would be, and there's a much longer, bigger issue here, odd to argue that there were no deprived people left in London, but it's an interesting question of whether they're relatively less deprived now than in the past, compared with those in, say, the Midlands and the North, Blackpool and Barnsley versus Hackney and Lambeth. Is that relative change one that should be reflected in this way? And that's what's happening here.
Yeah. So you could sort of say, if you were being very London centric about this, you could sort of hold your hands up a bit and say, well, okay, Westminster and Wandsworth, well, they had it coming. But as you mentioned, it's a different story if you're Lambeth or Camden, which are among those, I believe, that could be big losers. And I'm not sure what the sort of reserve situation is with those boroughs, but I think not great. Is that right?
So we also add notably Richmond, which is in outer London. It does very badly as well. So let's not forget Richmond. But yes, you're right. Some boroughs do have large amounts of money in the bank, reserves, as they're known in local government trade. Westminster certainly does. I don't know about Wandsworth, but so it's possible, therefore, that money could be taken out of these reserves, prudently built up, I might add, and spent. You can only spend them once, mind you, like any money we all have in the bank. You can only spend it once. But that would be okay for boroughs that do have reserves. I'm pretty sure that Lambeth, Southwark, Lambeth in particular, don't have big reserves. We don't really know the position in all of them. So I think that it's fine for a year or two if you've got money in the bank, but thereafter the effect will be real, and the real and felt on service levels.
Yeah, okay. So if you're Enfield, you might be feeling, well, okay, this looks all right to me. But if you're some of those inner London boroughs that we've been talking about, central London boroughs that we've been talking about, it's pretty hefty, isn't it? I mean, they're taking a lot of money from those people. Surely that can't be allowed to stand. So surely there has to be some adjustment and rethink with some of those boroughs.
One would think so, because the government builds a so-called a kind of safety net into all of this. So even if a council is going to lose 30, 40, 50, 60, huge numbers of millions of pounds, in theory, what the government does is say, well, for the first 3 years, that's the years from next April for the next 2 after that, then there will be a maximum loss. And effectively, what they've been talking about is that these councils will see the amount they have to spend in cash frozen. Trouble is, inflation's running at 3.5%. So that would mean, in effect, 3.5%, 4% cuts per year in real spending in boroughs which are in many cases spending less today than they were back in 2010, because the whole of local government is still spending less than it was 15 years ago. So, I think reasonableness suggests this is not reasonable, because you're saying to councils that still have exactly the same duties that they have to, services they have to deliver. There's a big pressure on, notwithstanding falling school rolls in inner London, across London, very high demands, as there are in other parts of the country, for children with special educational needs. Most of London has a massive demand for temporary accommodation. Housing costs are very high. So if you add all of that in, then the boroughs, I think, trying to cut their budgets even more than they've been cut already with these growing demands on services, it's sort of, you'd never do it to the health service, let's put it like that. The health service is getting substantial real increases in its spending, and local government in some cases is having those same its resources cut sharply, and that's certainly true in inner London.
And is it fair to say that local government in general has been, not very high at the priority list for quite some while? Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I mean, this is true now. It's a bipartisan policy, really, because although there's a little bit of extra money the current government has got for the next 2 or 3 years, it's a small amount. And to be fair to him, when Michael Gove was the Conservative equivalent minister in charge for the last 3 years he was there, he managed to get a bit of extra money. Trouble is, this just takes local government in London and other parts of England, to a level of spending below 2010 in real terms, but just not as far below as it once was. So if you add all of this together, it's pretty bad news for London as a whole, and very bad news for inner London. By the way, politically, just to show that the fates have a sense of humour, because many of the councils that are most likely to gain out of this redistribution will include those that voted Reform in May this year, so were won by Reform, Nigel Farage's new party. So they may get a benefit out of all of this, and that, of course, opens the political possibility of Reform being able to claim, vote Reform, get lower council taxes, though it'll be because of the redistribution of money that we're discussing here.
Okay, so to sum up, we must hope that reasonableness prevails just to limit the damage.
Well, reasonableness is a word I chose with purpose. It's because all public institutions are required by law to behave reasonably. And, personally, I do just wonder whether saying to councils that are spending less now than they were 15 years ago, because of the fair funding review, you're going to have to spend even less for the next 3, 4, 5 years, comes perilously close to the edge of what is reasonable, but we'll see how that all turns out.
Okay, so if we've got a couple of minutes left and to talk about something that came upon us yesterday evening as we record this podcast, which is the Pride in Place funding, which it's taken me a while to get to grips with it, and I'm still going to have to consult my notes. But from what I can see, there are 169 specific areas in England, Scotland and Wales, which are going to be allocated £2 million a year for a decade. And there's going to be some sort of local forum to decide what this money should be spent on in those areas, which will be interesting of itself. And then there's a separate impact fund, part of the same overall thing. And in that case, there are going to be 95 local authority areas getting £1.5 million each for 2 years. Now, in the first case, the 169 specific areas, there are just two in Greater London. One is New Addington, right at the edge of Croydon, and the other one is Harold Hill right at the edge of Havering, or right at the edge of East London. And in the impact fund, the 7 boroughs that are going to be given these smaller sums for less time are Barking and Dagenham, Newham, Croydon, Enfield, Hounslow, Haringey, and Brent. Now, I don't know if that's fair to London or not. When I saw the first set of figures, the 169 specific areas, and saw that there are only 2 in the whole of Greater London, whereas Birmingham has got 8 areas. Birmingham, big city, not as big as London. Manchester, 4 areas. Liverpool, 4 areas. I thought, that's not fair. I feel slightly less annoyed about it now that I've seen that 7 boroughs are going to get some of this smaller pots of money. But I don't know. What do you think about it, Tony?
Well, I mean, these little allocations of cash follow on what the previous government did. So the previous government had something called a towns fund, and it had a number of other these little pots of cash that it would hand out to. And actually, it's worth saying, most of the monies, and certainly the first of these 2 schemes that you were outlining, is handed out to very small areas indeed. So it's 2 million a year, as you say, for 10 years, so 20 million in total, but actually into areas that are round about the size of a ward or smaller. So it's very targeted.
Yes, in fact, I mean, I should say it's just not just New Addington. I think it's New Addington East or West. It's a bit of New Addington. These are these very, very tiny geographical areas that the statisticians use, aren't they? I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, begging the intriguing question, given it's very concentrated in a small area, there are quite a lot of other areas in London that are, in not dissimilar circumstances, as there are in other cities and towns around the country. And this applies to Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland as well, this one. So quite what all the other areas feel about this, I don't know, because it really is targeting the money on a very small proportion of the population. Now, it's true, and there's a fascinating piece of research in the Times newspaper today showing how the allocations correlate, their data journalists looked at this, correlate with reform or potential reform voting. Doubtless a coincidence. So what you can see is here that, just aim off for the remark about politics, that what the government's trying to do, as its predecessor did, is to identify pretty small areas, neighbourhoods smaller than that even, which are seen to have particular needs in terms of, I don't know, a lack of the capacity for people to, the high street doesn't look very good, the shops are not great, people don't feel that the neighbourhood is working very well for them, to target money on them to make it feel better. Now, and of course, I think, and this is for a whole further afternoon to talk about this really, the way in which the government and its predecessor now measures the need for these things is rather different to the way they've measured need in the past. Need now is more about issues like sort of local cohesion. Cohesion is not too complicated a word. I mean, the way in which neighbourhoods work, people get on, have neighbours and friends and places to go to, nice shops, all of that, which is quite a long way from the way we used to measure need, which had to do with housing costs and deprivation as measured on other measures. So I think what's going on is quite a big change of gear in government to the way they measure the need to spend public money. And to put it at its simplest, places outside London qualify more for this money now than they used to in the past.
Sounds a bit like repairing what we used to call the social fabric in some sort of...
It is. Well, the more mature of your listeners and viewers will, of course, there's a more than an echo of the 1960s and 70s about this. And those who, looked at the social and economic problems of what was called the inner cities, places where there was squatting and people leaving parts of the inner city, a lot of industrial decline in East London, South London in the 60s and 70s, and sort of urbanists and sociologists poured in to study all of this. And their analysis about community and what they often call social capital is very close to where I think public policy is now heading again, really 50 or 60 years later.
All right, that's extraordinarily interesting. Now I'm going to ask you one last thing. So I went to an event and sat on a panel at an event at the Lib Dems conference a few days ago, and the theme of the event, the title of it was how can we get central government to love London again? They don't really seem to be loving us all that much. Would you agree with that? What would your answer to that question have been?
They don't show a great sign. I did hear the Prime Minister on the television, I think it was last night, in the matter of Donald Trump and Sadiq Khan, saying that he was proud of London, what a wonderful city it was, or words to that effect. But I think, and of course we now have the relevant cabinet minister for housing, communities and local government, Steve Reed, is a Croydon MP. The new minister for local government, though she's a Wirral MP, used to be a councillor in South London. That's Alison McGovern. The housing minister is a London MP, Matthew Pennycook. So you'd think that the voice of London would be reasonably well heard inside the relevant government department. But I think what's driving ministers right across government is a fear of reform and a fear of the forces that are producing more and more people willing not to vote Labour but to vote Reform, not to vote Conservative but to vote Reform. And I think to some extent they think London will go on voting Labour or Conservative and that they can sort of, I wouldn't say ignore it, but they need to turn their attention elsewhere. That sounds a bit cynical and political, but in the end, we're all guilty of unconsciously doing things that we know we shouldn't, and I suspect there's a little bit of that in there.
Okay, I am not going to ask you how you think this trajectory is going to play out in the borough elections next May. That's for another day. I'd like to thank you very much indeed, Tony. It's been brilliant. Thank you
Thanks,
so
Dave.
much. Okay,
Great
thanks.
fun. Thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.